My dad always thought I was nothing more than army trash, until the groom stood at attention and called me his commanding officer. The look on Dad's face? Priceless. I'm Madison Thompson, and for 28 years I've been the daughter my father never wanted. Not because I was a bad kid, quite the opposite actually. I graduated valedictorian, got into Stanford on a full scholarship, and had my pick of law schools. But instead of following the path Dad had mapped out for me, I chose something that, in his eyes, was unforgivable. I enlisted in the Army. "Madison, you're throwing your life away," he said the day I told him about my decision. We were sitting in his pristine home office, surrounded by his degrees and awards from 30 years as a corporate lawyer. The military is where people go when they can't make it in the real world. It's for kids who peaked in high school and have nowhere else to turn. I tried to explain my reasons, the sense of purpose, the desire to serve something bigger than myself, the leadership opportunities that would shape me in ways no boardroom ever could. But Dad wasn't listening. He was already planning his excuses for why his Harvard-bound daughter had settled for what he considered a dead-end career. The disappointment in his voice was crushing, but it was nothing compared to the years that followed. Every phone call home became a passive-aggressive interrogation about when I'd come to my senses and use my GI Bill for something worthwhile. Every family gathering turned into an opportunity for him to introduce me with phrases like, "This is Madison, she's in the military," always with that tone that suggested he was apologizing for my existence. Mom tried to play peacekeeper, but even she didn't fully understand what my service meant. When I'd call home after particularly challenging missions or difficult training exercises, she'd listen politely but change the subject quickly. It was clear that my military life was something the family tolerated rather than celebrated. What they didn't know, what I deliberately kept from them, was that I wasn't just surviving in the Army. I was thriving. Within 5 years, I'd earned my commission through officer candidate school. By year 7, I was leading a platoon in Afghanistan. By year 10, I'd been promoted to captain and was commanding an entire company of 200 soldiers. I had commendations for valor, letters of appreciation from generals, and the respect of every person who served under me. My soldiers called me Iron Madison, not because I was harsh, but because I was unbreakable. When they needed someone to lead them through impossible situations, they trusted me with their lives. When they needed someone to fight for their welfare back home, I was their advocate. When they needed someone to believe in them when no one else would, I was there. But none of that mattered to Dad. To him, I was still the disappointment who'd chosen playing soldier over a real career. The distance between us grew with each passing year. I stopped coming home for holidays, making excuses about deployments and training schedules. Some of those excuses were real. Military life doesn't pause for family gatherings. But many times, I could have made it home. I just couldn't bear another evening of being treated like the family failure. Mom would call every few weeks, updating me on family news and gently suggesting I visit more often. "Your father asks about you," she'd say, though we both knew his questions were more about when I'd give up my phase rather than genuine interest in my well-being. "He loves you, Madison," Mom would insist. "He just doesn't understand your world." And that was the problem. Dad had never tried to understand. He'd made his judgment the day I enlisted and stuck to it, regardless of any evidence to the contrary. In his mind, I was wasting my potential, playing dress-up in a uniform while my former classmates were becoming doctors, lawyers, and business executives. What hurt most wasn't just his disapproval, it was his complete inability to see who I'd become. The scared 18-year-old who'd left for basic training had been replaced by a confident leader who'd faced down enemy fire and earned the respect of career military officers twice my age. I'd saved lives, protected my country, and built something meaningful with my service. But to Dad, I was still just his disappointing daughter who'd made the wrong choice. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dad had spent his entire career arguing cases, advocating for clients, and building his reputation on his ability to see all sides of a situation. But when it came to his own daughter, he'd closed his mind completely. There was no evidence I could present, no achievement I could earn. That would change his fundamental belief that I'd thrown my life away. So I stopped trying. I built a life that didn't require his approval or understanding. I found family among my fellow soldiers, people who valued dedication, sacrifice, and service above personal profit. I discovered that respect could be earned through actions rather than inherited through family connections. I learned that my worth wasn't determined by my father's opinion of my choices. But the ache never fully went away. Deep down, I still craved the moment when Dad would look at me with pride instead of disappointment, when he'd see Major Madison Thompson instead of his failure of a daughter. I just never imagined that moment would come at my cousin Sarah's wedding, in front of 50 witnesses, in the most public and dramatic way possible. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, forwarded through 3 different addresses as military mail often required. Sarah was getting married to someone named Marcus, and apparently it was going to be the social event of the year for our extended family. Mom had included a handwritten note. "Please try to come, sweetheart. It would mean so much to Sarah and to me." I stared at the elegant invitation for a long time, weighing the pros and cons. On one hand, Sarah and I had been close growing up. She was the cousin who'd always believed in me, who'd written long emails during my deployments and sent care packages to share with my soldiers. She deserved to have me there on her special day. On the other hand, Dad would be there. And where Dad went, his commentary about my life choices followed. I could already imagine the conversations. "Yes, Madison's doing well. Well, she's still in the military, but we're hoping she'll transition to something more stable soon." The decision became easier when Sarah called me directly. "Madison, please tell me you're coming," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "I know things are weird with Uncle Robert, but this is my wedding. I want you there." "Of course I'll be there," I heard myself saying before I'd fully decided. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." "And bring your dress uniform," she added excitedly. "Marcus is military too." "Well, he was. He got out last year, but he'd love to meet another service member." Something about that comment made me pause. "What branch?" "Army, like you. He was deployed to Afghanistan a few years ago. Actually, he mentions this incredible officer who saved his unit during a particularly bad situation. Some major who—" "Sarah, I need to ask you a favor," I interrupted, my mind already spinning with possibilities I didn't want to consider. "Don't mention my rank or position to anyone, okay? I just want to be your cousin at this wedding, nothing more." "Oh," she agreed, though I could hear the confusion in her voice. After we hung up, I spent the next hour staring at my uniforms hanging in the closet. The dress blues with their ribbons and insignia that told the story of my military career. The combat patches that marked deployments. The rank insignia that I'd earned through years of dedication and sacrifice. In the end, I chose civilian clothes. A simple navy dress that Mom had helped me pick out years ago for another family function. Conservative, unremarkable, the kind of outfit that wouldn't draw attention or give Dad additional ammunition for his criticisms. If I was going to survive this wedding, it would be by flying under the radar. The flight to California gave me 6 hours to mentally prepare for what I knew would be a challenging weekend. I practiced responses to Dad's inevitable comments, rehearsed ways to deflect conversations about my career, and reminded myself that I was doing this for Sarah, not for family validation. Mom picked me up at the airport, and the drive to the hotel was filled with updates about extended family, wedding preparations, and carefully neutral questions about my life. She'd learned over the years not to push too hard for details about my military service, partly because she knew it made Dad uncomfortable and partly because she genuinely didn't know how to relate to that part of my life. "Your father's excited to see you," she said as we pulled into the hotel parking lot, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "I'm sure he is," I replied, knowing we both understood the subtext. He was excited to see me the same way someone might be excited to see a problematic relative at a family reunion, with a mixture of obligation and dread. The rehearsal dinner was exactly what I'd expected. Dad held court at one end of the table, regaling other family members with stories from his latest high-profile case. I sat near the other end, making polite conversation with aunts and uncles who asked vague questions about how I was doing, without really wanting detailed answers. Marcus seemed nice enough, polite, respectful, clearly head over heels for Sarah. He was tall and lean with the bearing of someone who'd spent time in uniform, though he'd traded his military bearing for the more relaxed posture of civilian life. When Sarah introduced us, he shook my hand firmly and thanked me for my service with the automatic courtesy that most veterans offered each other. "What was your MOS?" he asked, using the military term for job specialty. "Infantry officer," I replied, keeping my answer deliberately vague. His eyebrows raised slightly. "No kidding. I was 11 Bravo, infantry enlisted, did a tour in Afghanistan back in 1819. I nodded non-committally, not trusting myself to ask follow-up questions. Afghanistan in 2018-2019 could mean a lot of things, and I didn't want to accidentally reveal too much about my own deployments during that time frame. Fortunately, Sarah appeared at that moment to steal Marcus away for introductions to other family members, and I was saved from further military talk. The last thing I needed was for that conversation to continue within Dad's earshot. The rest of the evening passed without major incident. Dad made a few obligatory inquiries about my life, delivered with the tone of someone asking about an unpleasant medical condition. I gave equally obligatory responses designed to provide minimal information while maintaining family politeness. "Still enjoying your military experience?" he asked during dessert, the pause before military experience making it clear he couldn't bring himself to call it a career. "It's been fulfilling," I replied neutrally. "Well, I suppose it's given you some good life experience. Should serve you well when you decide to transition to something more permanent." I bit my tongue and smiled. After 10 years of this conversation, I'd learned that defending my choice only led to longer, more painful discussions. Better to let him maintain his illusions about my eventual transition to real life. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for Sarah's outdoor ceremony. I spent the morning helping with last-minute preparations, grateful to have tasks that kept me busy and away from extended family socializing. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Sarah looked radiant, Marcus looked nervous and happy, and their vows were personal and heartfelt. For a moment, I forgot about my complicated relationship with Dad and just focused on celebrating two people who clearly loved each other. The reception was held at an elegant country club, the kind of venue that Dad appreciated for its prestige and networking opportunities. Cocktail hour began immediately after the ceremony, and I found myself nursing a glass of wine while making small talk with relatives I saw maybe once every few years. I was discussing Sarah's college years with my aunt when I noticed Dad approaching our small group. He'd had a few drinks, not enough to be noticeably intoxicated, but enough to loosen his usual filter. In his hand was a glass of red wine, and his face had the slightly flushed look that meant he was feeling confident and social. "Madison," he said loudly as if he'd just discovered me at the party. "There's my daughter, everyone, the one I've been telling you about." My stomach clenched. Dad announcing my presence was never a good sign, especially when he'd been drinking. I glanced around and noticed that several people had turned our way, including a few members of the wedding party who'd wandered over during cocktail hour. "Madison here decided to join the military instead of going to law school," Dad continued, his voice carrying that tone of forced joviality that barely concealed his embarrassment. "Can you believe that? Harvard Law accepting her, and she chose to play soldier instead." I felt my cheeks burn, but I kept my expression neutral. "Dad, maybe we shouldn't—" "Oh, come on, it's a party," he interrupted, taking another sip of wine. "I'm allowed to brag about my daughter's interesting career choices." The small group around us had grown awkwardly quiet. My aunt looked mortified, clearly recognizing that this conversation was heading nowhere good. A few wedding guests who'd been passing by had stopped to listen, drawn by Dad's increasingly loud voice. And that's when I noticed Marcus approaching our group, Sarah on his arm. They'd been making rounds, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. Sarah looked beautiful and happy, clearly enjoying her perfect day. The last thing I wanted was for Dad's commentary about my life to cast a shadow over her celebration. "Besides," Dad continued, oblivious to the growing audience or my obvious discomfort, "someone needs to explain to these nice people why my brilliant daughter is still single and playing dress-up instead of building a real career." The words hit like a slap, not just because of what he said, but because of where he said it. In front of Sarah, in front of Marcus, in front of relatives and wedding guests who barely knew me but would now forever associate me with Dad's version of my story. I opened my mouth to respond, to somehow deflect or minimize the damage, but Dad wasn't finished. "Don't mind her," he said, with a dismissive wave toward me, his voice now loud enough that conversations at nearby tables began to pause. "She's just army trash." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I felt the breath leave my lungs, felt the familiar sting of tears threatening behind my eyes. After 10 years of his disapproval, after countless smaller humiliations, Dad had finally said what he really thought of me, in public, at my cousin's wedding, in front of people who mattered to me. I saw Sarah's face crumple with shock and anger. I saw my aunt's hand fly to her mouth in horror. I saw several wedding guests exchange uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing that they'd just witnessed something deeply inappropriate. But most importantly, I saw Marcus freeze in place, his face cycling through a series of expressions I couldn't quite read: recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like respect? That's when everything changed. Marcus stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my stomach drop. I could see the wheels turning in his head, recognition dawning across his features like sunrise breaking over a battlefield. His face had gone pale, then flushed, then settled into something between awe and disbelief. "Madison Thompson," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Major Madison Thompson." The way he said my name, with reverence, with recognition, with something that sounded dangerously close to hero worship, made my blood run cold. This was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid. I gave him the slightest shake of my head, a barely perceptible plea to let this moment pass, to not make this about me on what should be his and Sarah's perfect day. But Marcus had spent 4 years in the Army, and he understood the weight of honor and recognition in a way that transcended social convenience. His military bearing returned instantly, shoulders straightening, feet coming together at attention. The relaxed civilian posture he'd worn all weekend vanished, replaced by the sharp discipline of a soldier who'd just encountered his commanding officer. I watched in slow motion as his hand began to rise in what I knew would be a perfect military salute. The kind of salute that would shatter Dad's carefully constructed narrative about his army trash daughter. The kind of salute that would expose every lie he'd told himself about my service. "No," I mouthed silently, but Marcus was already committed to his course of action. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent cocktail area with parade ground precision, "that trash is my commanding officer." His hand snapped to his forehead in a textbook salute, his entire body radiating the respect and discipline that only came from genuine military service. The sharp crack of his heels coming together echoed off the country club's vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. The effect was immediate and devastating. Dad's wine glass, which had been halfway to his lips, froze in mid-air. His mouth fell open, wine spilling over the rim and down his chin before he caught himself and hastily tried to recover. But the damage was done. Red wine splattered across his white dress shirt and down the front of his expensive suit jacket. The silence that followed was deafening. 50 wedding guests turned to stare, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Someone's champagne flute clinked against a table. A child's laughter from somewhere across the reception area sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Ma'am," he continued, maintaining his salute as other movement caught my peripheral vision. "Major Thompson saved my entire unit in Kandahar province, September 2018. 17 soldiers owe their lives to her tactical brilliance and personal courage under enemy fire. That's when I noticed them. 3 other men in the wedding party who'd gone similarly rigid at Marcus's words. Sarah's college friends, I'd assumed, or maybe Marcus's civilian buddies. But the way they moved, the way their postures straightened, and their expressions shifted to mirror Marcus's respect, told a different story. One by one, they stepped forward and joined Marcus's salute. "Sergeant Williams, ma'am," said a tall black man who'd been laughing at the bar just moments before. "You pulled me out of that burning Humvee when everyone else said it was too dangerous. Doctors said I wouldn't have lasted another 5 minutes. Corporal Jackson," added a shorter man with a pronounced scar running along his jawline. "You carried my wounded ass 3 miles through enemy territory to the extraction point. Never left a soldier behind, just like you promised." "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," said the third, his voice thick with emotion. "You fought the brass for 6 months to get my PTSD treatment approved. My wife says you saved my marriage, not just my life." 4 soldiers standing at perfect attention in their wedding attire, saluting me while my father stood frozen with wine dripping down his shirt. The juxtaposition was so surreal that I almost wondered if I was dreaming. But the expressions on the faces around us were all too real. Sarah stood with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks as she finally understood why I'd been so reluctant to talk about my military service. My aunt had gone completely pale, her eyes darting between the saluting soldiers and Dad's mortified face. Other wedding guests were pulling out phones, some recording what they clearly recognized as an extraordinary moment. Servers had stopped mid-service to watch. Even the wedding photographer had abandoned the bride and groom portraits to capture this unexpected drama. And Dad looked like he'd seen a ghost. The wine glass slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone patio with a crash that seemed to break the spell, holding everyone motionless. Red wine and glass shards scattered across the ground at his feet, but he didn't seem to notice. I don't," he stammered, his lawyer's eloquence completely abandoned. "How is this? When did you—" I finally found my voice, though it came out steadier than I felt. "At ease, soldiers." 4 hands dropped simultaneously, but their attention remained focused on me with the kind of respect that couldn't be faked or commanded, only earned through blood, sweat, and shared sacrifice. Marcus stepped forward, his formal military bearing softening into something more personal, but no less intense. "Ma'am, I've been trying to track you down for 3 years to properly thank you. When Sarah mentioned her cousin Madison was military, I never imagined— what are the odds?" "Pretty astronomical," I admitted, my mind still reeling from how quickly this situation had spiraled beyond my control. "The Kandahar mission," Sergeant Williams added, his voice carrying to the crowd that had now completely surrounded us. 17 American soldiers pinned down by enemy fire for 14 hours. No way out. No air support available. Ammunition running low. Command was ready to write us off as casualties. But Major Thompson had other ideas. Corporal Jackson continued, picking up the story with the practiced ease of soldiers who'd told this tale many times. "She took a squad of volunteers on a flanking maneuver that military textbooks said was impossible. 3 miles through territory crawling with Taliban fighters. She called in danger-close artillery strikes on her own position," Rodriguez added, his eyes never leaving my face. "Walked those shells to within 50 meters of her own troops to break the enemy's hold on our position. And when the dust settled," Marcus concluded, "she led the rescue personally. Carried wounded soldiers to the extraction point under continued enemy fire, refused medical attention until every single soldier under her command was accounted for and safe." The silence that followed this recitation was different from before. Where there had been shock and confusion, now there was something approaching awe. These weren't abstract military achievements being discussed. They were life and death moments that had forged unbreakable bonds between soldiers. I could see Dad struggling to process this information, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been the first stirrings of recognition. For 10 years, he'd dismissed my military service as a phase, a mistake, a waste of potential. But hearing these men describe actions that had saved lives and earned military decorations forced him to confront a reality he'd refused to acknowledge. Sarah broke the silence first, her voice shaky with emotion. "Madison, why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us think?" "Because I didn't need your approval," I said gently, though my eyes remained on Dad. "I never served for recognition or family pride. I served because it was the right thing to do. The words hung in the air like an indictment, though I hadn't intended them that way. But the truth was undeniable. I'd hidden my achievements not because I was ashamed of them, but because I'd learned that sharing them only led to more conflict with Dad. More wedding guests had gathered now, forming a loose circle around our group. I could hear whispered conversations as people tried to piece together what they'd just witnessed. Someone mentioned seeing my story on the news years ago. Another person recognized the name of the Kandahar mission from military documentaries. The Medal of Valor, someone said from the crowd. I remember reading about that mission. The commanding officer received the Medal of Valor for extraordinary heroism. All eyes turned back to me, and I felt the familiar discomfort of unwanted attention. Military decorations were deeply personal things, earned through sacrifice and worn with humility. They weren't party conversation topics or tools for family vindication. But Dad's expression was changing again, his lawyer's mind finally processing the implications of what he'd heard. Medal of Valor? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. That's one of the highest honors. Third highest, Marcus confirmed. Below the Medal of Honor and Distinguished Service Cross. It's awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat operations. I watched Dad's face as this information sank in. For a decade, he'd dismissed my military career as a waste of my potential. He'd introduced me to colleagues and friends as his daughter who'd chosen the military with the same tone he might use to describe a chronic illness. He'd built his entire narrative around the idea that I'd thrown away my future for a dead-end job. But Medal of Valor recipients didn't have dead-end jobs. They were the kind of soldiers whose stories appeared in military history books, whose actions were studied in war colleges, whose names were remembered long after their service ended. I need to sit down, Dad said suddenly, his face having gone completely white. He looked around for a chair, but his movements were unsteady, disoriented. Mom, who'd been standing frozen in shock since Marcus's initial salute, finally snapped into action. She rushed to Dad's side, guiding him to a nearby cocktail table where he collapsed into a chair with the boneless grace of someone whose world had just been fundamentally reorganized. 30 years, he mumbled, staring at his wine-stained hands. 30 years I've been telling people my daughter was wasting her life. The admission was so quiet that only those closest to our group could hear it, but in the context of everything that had just happened, it hit like a thunderclap. This wasn't just about military service or career choices anymore. This was about a father confronting the magnitude of his failure to understand his own child. Sarah had moved to my side, her wedding dress rustling as she took my hand. Madison, I'm so sorry. If I'd known... If any of us had known. It's not your fault, I said, squeezing her hand. I chose not to share this part of my life with the family. I thought it would be easier. Easier for who? Dad asked, his voice hollow. Easier for me to keep embarrassing myself? Easier for me to keep telling people that my daughter was a failure? The naked pain in his voice was almost harder to bear than his years of dismissal had been. At least his disapproval had been familiar, predictable. This raw vulnerability was uncharted territory for both of us. Marcus seemed to sense that this had become a private family moment, but his military training wouldn't let him leave without proper closure. Ma'am, I know this isn't the time or place, but I need you to know, every man in my unit talks about you. You're the standard we measure leadership against. You're the officer we all hope to become. He paused, his voice becoming more personal. My daughter's middle name is Madison. We named her after the officer who made sure her daddy came home alive. That revelation broke something inside me that I'd been holding together through sheer force of will. For 10 years, I'd convinced myself that my family's approval didn't matter, that the respect of my soldiers was enough. But hearing that my actions had rippled out into the world in ways I'd never imagined, that a child carried my name because of a decision I'd made in a moment of crisis, brought home the true weight of service in a way that medals and commendations never could. I felt tears threatening for the second time that day, but these were different from the hurt and humiliation I'd felt earlier. These were tears of recognition, of finally being seen for who I really was rather than who people assumed me to be. "Thank you," I managed to say to Marcus. "All of you. But you know this isn't how military protocol works. I should be thanking you for your service, not the other way around." "Protocol doesn't cover everything, ma'am," Sergeant Williams said with a grin. "Some things are just right." The crowd around us was beginning to disperse, sensing that the dramatic moment had passed and normal wedding festivities should resume. But the energy of the reception had fundamentally changed. Conversations now carried the excited buzz of people who'd witnessed something extraordinary, something they'd be talking about for years to come. Dad remained slumped in his chair, staring at nothing as he processed the evening's revelations. Mom hovered nearby, clearly torn between supporting her husband and celebrating her daughter's long-hidden achievements. Sarah, ever the gracious hostess even in crisis, began gently encouraging guests to return to the bar and dinner service. But her eyes kept returning to me with a mixture of pride and regret that I recognized all too well. "We need to talk," Dad said suddenly, his voice carrying across the space between us with startling clarity. "Madison, we need to talk." I looked at him sitting there in his wine-stained shirt, his carefully constructed worldview in ruins around his feet, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my father: compassion. "Yes," I said simply. "We do." The wedding reception continued around us, but everything had changed. The daughter Dad had dismissed as Army trash was gone, replaced by Major Madison Thompson, a decorated combat veteran, a leader of soldiers, a woman whose actions had saved lives and earned the highest respect of those who served alongside her. There would be difficult conversations ahead, apologies that needed to be made, and relationships that would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. But for the first time in 10 years, I had hope that my father might finally be ready to see me as I really was. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough.